and myself have been involved in the Khayelitsha area, where we've been looking at people who are often victims of flooding and trying to understand the relationship between people's risk preferences and also to what extent they engage in mitigation or adaptation activities to prevent themselves from being impacted by flooding. And then we also wanting to see, in addition to the sort of mainstream ways that they can engage in adaptation, what the appetite is for insurance and to what extent they've looked at that as an avenue. So just to give you a bit of background, as I said, we try to look at adaptive behavior and insurance with regards to the uptake of flood mitigation. Here, what we do in order to elicit people's risk preferences, we play experimental games with them. And so we elicit their risk preferences where in a situation where we basically do lotteries with them where they get paid real money, and then over a series of such sets of games, we elicit their risk preferences in terms of different classes of sort of very risk-averse to more risk-seeking behavior. And then we try and match that up with the real activities in terms of how much they engage with in mitigation activities. So a problem with a lot of Cape Town's informal settlements is that it's situated on the Cape Flats. So it's a low-lying area and high water table. And so a lot of the informal settlements are also adjacent to rivers and canals, and so and retention pools, which is prone to flooding. One of the other problems, we've engaged quite a lot with the City of Cape Town on this to try and see what is being done, what are the main problems. And there's a lot of inadequate stormwater infrastructure, as most of you also will have seen in the last winter in Cape Town along roads, but in those areas specifically. And then there's also rubbish blockages in drainage pipes because of poor service infrastructure when it comes to basic services and rubbish removal. We looked at a survey of the City of Cape Town from 2005, where they surveyed 3 informal settlements in the Cape Flats areas, and it seems like up to 83% of residents in those areas have been affected by the flooding. The City of Cape Town's flooding and storm planning task team has shown that 20 informal settlements in the Cape Flats area are at high risk of winter flooding, and 14 of those have been classified high risk to the extent that they need to be relocated. The problem is that relocation is not a really short-term reality for most of them. So we then tried to look at what are the flood mitigation strategies. So since this happened sort of post-flooding, it really falls in the adaptation realm, but the main mechanisms that they can deal with this is to ensure that the floor is elevated off the ground on pallets, stilts, or sandbags. We see whether they perform general maintenance on the roof before a rainy season. They can also ensure whether that the roof is slanted. Another method is to secure plastic sheeting to the roof or to the floor. And then lastly, they can also ensure that trenches or channels around the home is being dug and not blocked with refuse. So this is our recruitment area for those of you coming along there from the airport. This is on the BM section of Khayelitsha, and it's very flood prone. What we did is we got about 120 people randomly selected from those areas. We engaged them in surveys where we obtained demographic information. We asked them about financial questions about their saving, credit, and insurance behavior. And also the experience with floods and fires in the past. We then very carefully elicited information about their flood and fire mitigation strategies that they've engaged with up to that point. After that, we played these games with them where we listed their risk preferences, and we observed the engagement in risky activities and also asked them questions about that, to what extent they were engaged in risky activities in their real life and to what extent they engaged in lotteries, etc. As I mentioned to you, we were interested in to what extent people would be interested in insurance uptake, and we approached Hollard, who normally offers an insurance product for the informal market through some of the retailers. And we actually, in this session, at the end of the session, we offered them the insurance product to see to what extent people would be interested in that as a mechanism to hedge against flooding. It was interesting because normally most of the insurance companies do not offer any products to people at that end of the market, since it's so high risk and they're so low income. We need to do a lot more research around this issue, and that's one of the things that we try to unpack in this study, whether it's people's lack of knowledge about insurance, or whether insurance is appropriate in this kind of context, or is it the fact that there's no instruments available to them that make them seek other avenues and not take this up as a potential avenue for hedging their risk. So I'm not going to go into much depth about the experiments in this talk, but this is the kind of sort of games we play where we give people different options, where there's different outcomes attached to them, and they choose multiple sets of these options, and through that we establish their level of risk aversion. We represent probabilities through spinning wheels, which people are normally quite familiar with, and we do several training and practice sessions to make sure that everybody understands and are on board. I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to say in general, most of the people in the income bracket that we're dealing with are in the 1,000 to 2,000 Rand a month income bracket. So people are really poor, and that also makes you wonder to what extent they're able to sort of engage in costly activities to adapt to flooding risk. There's a picture, and often this is maybe even not the worst case scenario. You've seen pictures the last winter of people basically standing in water in their own homes. From the survey that we engaged people in, we observed that up to 33% of people have experienced damage in their home, 48% had property damage, 24% reported that their floor is often wet or under water during the winter time. Roads around the home are wet and muddy. It's difficult to reach communal toilets. You see up to 30% responded that that was the case for them. Up to 43% of people said that their children become sick, or their children from pools of flood water. 43% had experienced electricity outages. And then, interesting also, we wanted to try and find out whether people remain in their dwelling after these flooding events or whether they move away. And 52% indicated that they actually prefer to stay there because of fear that people may steal their belongings. I'm not going to spend much time on this now, but as I said, what we tried to test or to elicit information about was the level of engagement in mitigation activities. And so what we actually saw was that things like raising the floor, putting plastic sheeting on the roof, digging trenches around the home are activities that a lot of the people in the samples did engage with. We tried to sort of classify this into sort of different groups in terms of the different mitigation activities, in terms of those who do almost nothing, those who engage in sort of least costly activities, and those who engage in most costly activities. We still need to unpack some of this, but what it seems is that if we try and map people's risk preferences to the extent to which they engage in these mitigation or adaptation activities, it is the case that more risk-averse people will actually incur more cost to adapt or to mitigate against flooding. And it's specifically females who are risk-averse who would tend to engage in very costly activities like assuring that there's plastic sheeting on the roof, digging trenches around the home, etc. So this is just where we try to then see what determines whether people actually engage in adaptation. And something that we picked up on is the extent to which people have experienced flooding and had damage from flooding in the past seems to be a very important indicator of whether they will engage in adaptive measures subsequently. Then what is quite interesting is that whether people has engaged, has experienced flooding in the past and have experienced bad damage does not seem to indicate their appetite for insurance. And so this is what we're trying to sort of unpack now, is why, although almost 50% of our samples seem to have a high appetite for insurance, this is not linked to their past experiences with flooding. And it could be the fact that people just aren't that familiar with what insurance does and that there's some need for more financial literacy training. But it could also be that there's other constraints to whether people take up insurance, such as, you know, financial issues, liquidity issues, that prevents them from doing that, and so they don't even view that as an avenue for mitigation or hedging against their risk. So just sort of in wrapping up, we find that risk preferences are correlated with adaptive strategies, but we don't find a correlation there between risk preferences and demand for insurance. But we, and also no correlation between past damage from flooding and interest in insurance. So again, as I say, what we need to try and find out through further research is if insurance is really not an avenue for adaptation with regards to flooding, or whether there's a whole lot of complicated other issues around whether people can access insurance that prevent them from doing so, and that maybe the actual products that needs to be developed needs to look different, more in line with the current Stokvels, which people are familiar with, and there's a lot more trust in those scenarios. Thanks so much. You need this one.
Thank you very much, Martine. Are there any questions for clarity? No?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask about sort of the cost of the insurance product compared to extra costs that they would incur, those who are raising houses or pallets or those things.
I think the cost of the insurance is often like it's a monthly expenditure, and so that's something that is difficult for them to commit to. It's not that much more than some of these other costs, like lifting their house and putting it on stilts. But that is something that they could probably plan for, and it's a once-off expenditure.